turn off your video at this point. But again, this is our first roundtable of the semester. We're speaking about AB 540, streamlining AB 540 processing through self-certification. And so before we kind of dive into what self-certification is and hear from our panelists, I actually kind of want to hear from folks just some of the challenges that come up for you all while you're processing AB 540 affidavits or just AB 540 in general on your campus. And even if you're not the person who does the processing on your campus specifically, like what are some of the challenges you hear from your students, the folks you work with in getting students that AB 540 status on their campus. And you can do this by actually answering on menti.com with this code that's up on the screen that I think Nancy put in the chat, or you can use the QR code that is here on the screen too. So I'll give folks some time to do that. Let me actually pull up the other screen. The QR code will be there too. Second, sorry. Okay, so as we see here, some of the challenges that people are already naming, confusion is a big one, non-credit hours, students not being eligible, there's frustration, uncertainty, not knowing about it. I'm guessing that's not knowing about AB 540 in general. There's fear, information is not distributed, issues with interpretation of AB 540. Fear is looking like a first one. Confusion, right, is a big one. The form is confusing. First time I heard about it. Okay. As folks are seeing this on the screen, or as they're putting their answers, I'm wondering if anybody actually wants to share about an answer that they put. They can go ahead and unmute themselves or put it in the chat. Just for this, to get us started, I do ask that our panelists not share yet. You'll have plenty of time to share. And if I can hear from somebody else about something that they put on the screen. If you want to talk a little bit more. Okay, Guillermo, I see that you put specifically around confusion. I was wondering if you want to speak a little bit more about that.
When students try to join EOPS, I think they're under the assumption that because they're undocumented, they can't apply, which they can. It's just that the information that they receive perhaps at other departments such as admissions. I had one student that tried to join TRIO, couldn't get in, so assumed that they couldn't get into EOPS. But just lack of information, I think, causes confusion, which then lack of motivation, and they just don't follow through to try to join.
Yeah, yeah.
Lots of confusion.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, right? Yeah, like just sometimes students are just not informed as they're going through as they're getting to college, right? There's a lot of like miscommunication or like information around not undocumented students not qualifying for certain things, right? And then I see that somebody also put too much information and reactive and not proactive. I'm curious for the person who put too much information, if they want to talk about that.
Sure. Just whenever notices are sent out in regards to AB 540, you can lose your audience with too many words. So you want to kind of make it simple.
Okay. Yeah. So like lots of language that could be there's just too much of that could be confusing for students, right? Could lead to like lack of follow through, so they're not like properly following the steps, right, to apply for AB 540. Okay, maybe one more person to speak about what they put on the screen or something that they are noticing what's on the screen.
So I can speak a little bit. I think that when a student hears about AB 540 for a first time, they can misinterpret it, or they may not necessarily understand the language that it's saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think goes back to what someone said about having too much information, that even for us it's difficult to understand. So it's um, understandable as to why students may not necessarily understand what information they're being given if they're hearing it for the first time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's very similar to what Diane put in the chat here around like how to simplify AB 540 enough so that students and other faculty who may come across those students, right, who can explain it to them, can understand it better. So yeah, so thank you all for sharing that, right? I think in general, as we're seeing with this Mentimeter here, that AB 540 can be pretty confusing and has expanded so many times over the years which is really great because more and more students, regardless of their like educational pathway, is able to qualify, but that does add confusion to like who is eligible, who's not eligible, and what's the process in order to be eligible. And so before I move on to the next slide, just quick pop quiz, right? I think many people here in this call can answer it. What do people need to turn in order to apply for AB 540 at their campus? And you could just put that in the chat. What do they need to turn in? Yeah, I know a lot of people here work with AB 540. What do students need to turn in order to basically apply for AB 540 in their college? Not a trick question, just okay. So there you go. Affidavit. Okay, this is what I'm looking for. Yeah, so affidavit, school transcripts, right? Thank you. High school transcripts, high school diploma, anything that for most schools, right? There's always the additional requirement of turning in documentation to prove that they've met the attendance and degree requirement, in addition to that affidavit that people are also naming. And so people didn't name it here, which I'm kind of surprised about, but we actually found that one of the things that kind of gets in the way, in addition to the many things that folks name, right? Even after students understand AB 540, they're on their way to applying. One of the things that kind of get in the way of people actually getting AB 540 in their campus is they don't have the right documentations, like the right transcripts, for example, to prove that they have met the attendance and degree requirements. And so in 2021, we actually did a survey of AB 540 across the state of admissions and undocumented support personnel. And they found that like just getting these transcripts, right, and having, especially for folks who have not been in school for a while or are returning to school, have been a common challenge in proving that they have met the eligibility requirements for AB 540. So they can turn in the affidavit, right? They know that they have the right requirements met, but they don't have that transcript to kind of move their paperwork forward. And I think as folks who also work with students, the more paperwork, the more like things we ask for student, the higher chance that the follow through is low, and that students kind of don't complete the step necessary to get AB 540, even though they may qualify. And so that means there's many eligible students, right, who are kind of being shut out because they don't have access to these transcripts to prove their eligibility. And so that's why we're talking specifically about self-certification today. Doesn't solve all of the problems we named, unfortunately, but I think it does remove one common barrier in those transcripts. And when we talk about self-certification, this is a community college specific policy, right, that just relies on the AB 540 affidavit, which you see here on the screen, the community college specific one, as a legal document kind of proving and attesting that students have met that requirement. This policy is specifically based, can only be implemented with approval from the district's Board of Trustees. And if there are questions, if there are discrepancies, maybe with students' information, that's when campuses can actually ask for the documentation to kind of resolve those discrepancies. So while self-certification doesn't ask for documentation, including transcripts up front, it does not mean that students cannot ask for transcripts, but they can do it if there's questions arising. And technically, as Nancy mentioned, all of the public colleges can actually do this, but right now it's only at the community colleges because CSU and UC regents and Board of Trustees for those systems actually chose not to do it. And back in 2018, when we also did a project and survey of the California community colleges for the CCC Dreamers project, we identified that about 46 of the California community colleges actually use self-certification and verifying students for AB 540. That number might have fluctuated at this point, like some folks' processes might have changed, or maybe more people have it now, but a good number of community colleges do have it, and we'll be hearing from more of them today. And what is this kind of based off of? This is actually based off of a legal advisory from 2018 from the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office. The exact quotation is here on the screen. I won't read too much of it, but this is in that document. It is question 11, and it's specifically asking about if additional requirement is needed, additional documentation is needed for verification of AB 540. And the reading of the law for the community colleges basically said that it doesn't specify another verification outside of the affidavit, and that a district may actually rely exclusively on the student's self-certification through the affidavit when processing AB 540. And we just put that link in the chat too. It's question 11 if folks want to kind of dig a little bit deeper in that document. And so we'll hear more from our panelists, but why do self-certification? I think the most obvious one, right, is it does remove that burden for students of having to obtain those official or even unofficial transcripts when submitting their AB 540. There's just less documents they have to deal with. There's less documents that people also have to process. And so again, right, like higher follow through because they're just filling out that one affidavit. And for campus personnel, for people who are processing those documents, who are collecting those documents, who are informing students about how to apply, it does reduce the amount of paperwork needed for processing. And this is actually compliant with, it streamlines kind of the compliance with auditing. So for campuses with this policy, because they're just kind of like relying on that affidavit, they don't need like multiple documents, right, to prove that multiple documents for the auditing processes, basically because they have this policy and they can use that affidavit, just that affidavit solely. And again, just another reminder that campuses will, with self-certification, can still ask for documentation if there's like additional questions. And maybe some of our panelists can even touch on that. But again, this kind of streamlines, I think, a lot of the AB 540 processing and can address some of those barriers for students. And so I'm gonna transition us actually to our panel. They started to they introduced themselves already earlier this morning, but we have 3 folks. I'm gonna ask them to go on camera if they're not already on camera to start our panel. But we have Kyla from Riverside City College, Dean of Enrollment Services, Amy from Berkeley City College, also Dean of Enrollment Service, and Registrar from Moorpark College, Dave. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and actually pull up my questions. And we're going to get started. And so my first question for folks are just around how did you hear about AB 540 self-certification? And how long has it been implemented on your campus? And we'll kind of go in the order that I introduced folks. So maybe Kyla first, Amy, and then Dave.
So I started at RCC in 2017. And they had already been doing the self-certification. So when I started, because the decision had been made by like an interim person. So when I started, I was asked if I wanted to continue doing the self-certification or if I wanted to require us to have the documentation. And I remember thinking, why would anybody ask for the documentation if it's not required? It's a barrier to the student. But then also just at the time we only had a paper form. And so, you think about scanning in for, into OnBase, we have to document everything. And so for me, it was like, we would have to document everything. Like if you're requiring documentation, then you have to have all of that handy for an audit. And I don't know about you all, but we're not always totally caught up on our scanning. And if you have a packet like this versus one piece of paper, it's really easy to get things like lost. So yeah.
Thank you. Amy, what about you?
Hi, everyone. I think for me, the first time I heard about self-certification was probably in like 2016 or 2017. And it was something at the time I was at another college. I'm in a 4-college district, Berkeley City College, Laney College, Merritt College, and College of Alameda. And at the time, I think it every time I brought it up, it wasn't really a priority for folks. I don't think, there's so much going on in our district at the time. It was something that just kind of kept getting pushed off in conversations. And because of how closely the 4 colleges work together, 40% of our students swirl, it really needed to, at the time, it felt like it really needed to be a district-wide decision. But I think we were able to establish self-certification in spring 2018. We had a lot of different circumstances, which I can talk about a little bit later.
Thank you.
Hey, at Moorpark College, we were aware of the sort of revised guidelines from the Chancellor's office dated from 2007 that mentioned self-certification, but it was not in place when I started in 2013 until conversations began based on that additional legal advisory that you referenced in 2018. And at that time, we were really blessed to have administration that was attentive to the questions, and our Vice President for Business Services, who actually our financial aid area reports to the business services. Oddly, it's a little different. She was able to pose the question district-wide to vice presidents. And we are a 3-college district, and that affords us that ability to have conversations about how we're approaching things differently. And so having that conversation kick off at the administrative level really helped us. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the registrars dealt with it later.
Great, thank you. I did not know that it was all the way back, 2017 guidance, all the way back then. So thank you for sharing that too. But I'm hearing from folks, right, like collaboration, multiple departments, kind of multiple stakeholders, decision maker were the ones that kind of kicked off the decision. And it was really a way to kind of streamline and ease the processing for a lot of your departments and campuses. And I think speaking of that, folks have started to talk a little bit about it. I'm wondering if the folks, we can go in the reverse order that we went, if people can kind of name some of the benefits you've all already seen, if you have not named so yet, for your students and for like your personnel in general, and since you've had self-certification.
The benefits for self-certification, clearly you mentioned it, and not, okay, so this starts with everybody's comments around there's concern, there's confusion, it's not easy to understand. And I think what it is missing in that, and I'm sorry, I'm going off the rails of your question, the benefits, sure, but the hard part to understand for me is that this is really like the first part is the non-resident tuition. Understanding resident, non-resident is already complex and difficult, and really, I want to just, let's call it out. I mean, we're talking about institutional discrimination, legal discrimination based on citizenship or other factors. And so right away, people are hit with this. And I think this is why the whole thing is difficult and fraught, and why we need to come together and build capacity to get this changed. because it's really, it leaves students with a bad feeling. So what is the benefit? When they know they're being helped, when they know there's a waiver, when they know there's a path and a method, when we're able to give guidance on how to move forward and not have an inordinate expense or not be treated differently, that to me is right away it lifts a burden off the soul that meets, if you're wanting to focus on education, you have to be able to pay attention. And if you can't pay attention to details in front of you because of circumstances in your life or how you're being treated, I mean, institutional aggression. This is my point of view. I have really strong points of view as a registrar around residency as it is. It's rooted in the laws from 1860 from the UC related to protecting tax dollars for citizens. At the time, the definition of citizen was white male landowners. So I think we got to be really clear that this is intended to institutionalize discrimination. And as a result, I think we really have to have conversations like this, and hopefully with Sonia Christian and others who can assist us with alleviating this burden from people, because essentially what we're saying is people won't be treated equal in these colleges. Yeah. And that's a problem, right? So benefits to students, there's many benefits to our staff, of course, so when you're educating somebody about a complex issue that they've just encountered and they realize that it's a block on their future progress, you have to go through all that information. But if you then have to tell them, now you need to go to another institution and go back and get your records from that time, and we need to validate what you put under oath. An affidavit is a legal document attesting to circumstances. And what you're saying is, we don't trust you. Not only are we going to discriminate against you, but we don't trust you. We're going to validate what you're saying. Yeah. I'll leave it there and let other folks talk. And we'll get
no, thank you for starting us off really quick, like really strongly with that too, right? I think I constantly do hear that undocumented students specifically like feel so like treated so differently, right? And that like just that treatment can really like cut off, like, I'm not going to keep going. Like, this is already so complicated. I have so many steps I need to do. And that student never comes back. Right. And so I think even like bringing it down to even just like that, like a social justice lens, I've not heard before, but it is. Yeah. Right. Like it really is, and can really create like a completely different experience for an undocumented student specifically. So I'll turn it over to Amy now.
Sure. So I think Dave really hit the nail on everything. I co-sign everything he said. And I'm guessing that most of us who are here today really, Dave's remarks kind of like reiterate some of our values, right? And our perspective on why we either support self-certification and are implementing that in our institutions, or are here to learn how to do that. I would say in addition to kind of like the equity and like social justice rooted values there, in terms of benefits, like you kind of have to think about, what does your institution value? What is like the most important? What are like some of the hot button issues? And so for us, when I was at College of Alameda during 2017, we went through a CSAC audit, and it was a Cal Grant audit, and we actually had to repay funds related to our DREAM Act students. For college district, if a student files an affidavit at one college, they have that status. And because so many of our students swirl, right, we were we just definitely had issues where we were collecting transcripts for some students, sometimes not. People were collecting transcripts, but like not actually interpreting them, right? And in that manner, we had to pay back money. And so for our district, we have an issue with repeat audit findings. So for me, this was really like an opportunity to frame this as a benefit for the institution. And then I was able to move this much more quickly through, right? And so for me, I was able to just to talk to my college president and say, hey, we have to pay back this much money. This is what I think is the root of the issue. Until we figure it out at the district level, this is what I want to implement, self-certification just for our college. And he was fine with that, right? And then I was able to kind of bring that through. We work very closely with our 4 colleges, kind of do all of the legwork for the district for us to implement that. And so what that also means is, I think Dave was kind of talking about how complicated and how complex the interpretation of these policies are. And so at that time, I think it was with like SB 68, there was an expansion of AB 540, which was great. But for records and for auditing purposes, it becomes a nightmare, right? And so those are the particular values that I could speak to for my institution at that time. And that also, in terms of benefits, obviously for the students, our counselors, our A&R staff, our outreach staff, but then also our community partners. And so for us, once we changed and we moved to self-certification, every time we have like a counselor breakfast, we're doing outreach, this is what we explicitly say. This is the process for AB 540. Do not turn in your transcript, right? You just need to turn in this piece of paper where we rely exclusively on self-certification. And so I think that gives our partners a peace of mind, right? But then it also helps hold us accountable because, you know, let's be honest, we all have people in our institutions who, for whatever reasons, are, you know, may share misinformation, right? And so I think we really need to hold the institution accountable by making it very public with those who are interacting with us and those who are helping bring students to our colleges.
Thank you, Amy. Kyla?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on what Amy was saying about making sure everyone knows that AB 540 is an option. It's easy. Our outreach team actually will collect AB 540 forms while they're doing outreach at the high schools. So frequently the high school counselors kind of know, oh, and like with us, we have a lot of undocumented student clubs at the high school level. So our team will actually go to the club meeting, take forms, hey, fill these out. They fill them out, they bring them back, we process them. We also have the form available online, but for us, it's just really, we make sure it's really integrated. So where it is a bit of a hurdle to have to fill out this extra form, we try to make it, it's not a big deal, really easy form. You just fill it out, sign it, no big deal, we got you. We try to make it as drama-free as possible because it is kind of a scary form. So if they're doing it like with their peers and their friends and it's just part of the process, it's a little less intimidating. So we try to do that as much as possible. And our high school counselors are very well informed of the process. And then also we have an ed advisor who works directly with our adult schools, and he also does the same thing. And he's on our undocumented student task force. So he's a huge ally. And I think it's just really important to kind of figure out who across your campus is going to be an ally, and then just making sure they have the tools and that they're talking about it too, because the more it's talked about, the less, like, we're just demystifying it as much as possible. And then also, we send out frequent emails and text messages to students who are coded as non-residents. And the first thing we say is, hey, do you know about AB 540? Maybe you're eligible. Here's what it is. Here's a link to the form. It's really easy. So we just try to like have it all integrated so that it's creating less of that, like, oh, you're in this group. That's the first line of defense when somebody is coded as a non-resident is, hey, you might be AB 540 eligible.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think we heard right from the challenges earlier, just the confusion, how hard it is. It's even hard for faculty, right, who these students may be reaching first to explain all of that. And so self-certification also addresses some of that, right? It's very easy to inform people who are helping our students that it's a simple form, and actually it's just this one thing that you have to turn in, and that's the process. And that's easier for folks to remember than including all the transcripts, additional documentation. So it's also helping on the informing side, right? The educating side. And folks have kind of touched upon this with just the different people who are involved in the implementation process of self-certification at your campus. But I'm wondering, and we'll go first with Amy for this question, and Kyla, and then Dave. If you can kind of talk a little bit more about that implementation process, right? If you have not shared yet, who are the people who kind of were like these allies that folks are talking about? Any like lessons learned, strategies that you all use in getting this policy implemented in your district? Is there like, did you have to get campus buy-in? How did you kind of get campus buy-in? Because it does require, right, more than one person championing this policy for it to actually happen. So we'll go first with Amy in this question.
Sure. I think in terms of allies, sometimes those are departments and sometimes those are individuals, right? And so for me, that was like my colleagues, my colleagues at the other colleges, the other deans of enrollment services, and also the VPSSs. But importantly, I think we also have to think about who are the people who are going to, who are part of the decision-making process, but may not be on board. Right. And so I'm not going to name who the people are. This is a recorded roundtable. But again, I think really thinking about how do you frame this issue that speaks to something that will bring them along. Right. And so obviously there's a piece about students and access, enrollment, right? Funding, audits, liability. Those are all these different types of benefits and potential values that people have that sometimes may conflict, right? And so I would just say for folks who are trying to move this along at their colleges, to think from use a different strategy depending on who you're speaking to. For us also, that was like obviously financial aid, admissions and records, counseling, our adult education, EOPS, instruction, CE programs, all of our community partners, making sure that the language in our like catalog and our schedule, like all of that institutional language is also updated, so that it's very clear. So sorry, your question was about the allies?
Yeah, like, is there any other way, you kind of touched upon this too, like kind of how did you get the campus buy-in, I think, but you talked a little bit about like finding the reason that's going to speak to that group or to that stakeholder that you're talking about. But if there's any other kind of like lessons learned that you want people to know when getting this policy implemented.
I think you have to document it, right? So you may not be the decision maker, but whoever the decision maker is, once it's green, and once you get the green light, you need to document it and send it out to whoever is impacted on your in your college or district. And I'm constantly resending my original email to the district for 2018 that says, here's our process for self-certification, right? Like all of like my slide deck, everything like that, why we're doing that. And so I usually send that out like once a year to let people know, hey, this isn't something new. Right. We've agreed to this several years ago, and this is our process. And whenever we're onboarding new folks in admissions and records, financial aid, any of those impact areas, I let them know as well, because, folks are coming from other institutions and they may have different policies in place. I would also say right now, like in terms of allies, think about folks who have really embraced kind of the direction from the chancellor's office. I think especially during the pandemic, the chancellor's office has really encouraged removing barriers for students, right? And so we see that with like being more permissive about EWs, like removing the requirement for documentation, moving the pass not pass deadline, relying on self-certification, allowing self-certification for SFRF, right? And so if those are policies that you have in your college, who are the people who have championed that? Because those are all in alignment with removing barriers. And so those are just some of the suggestions that I would have.
Great, thank you. Kyla?
I would say if you're at a campus and you're not allowing self-certification, and you're not in a position, you don't feel like you're in a position to make that decision, figure out who would make that decision. And then if you need to, because I know there's some, like you might have a registrar who's not as cool as Dave, who has opinions that don't believe that students should be able to just self-certify. So figure out who is in that department that is an ally and kind of create that peer pressure just to put pressure on them. So like they're like, you've got one person out of a whole department who believes that students shouldn't be able to do this. That's crazy, right? So you have to kind of like work through sometimes like other channels to put the pressure, even if the pressure is like going up, if you have enough people that are unified on this and you're like, look, there's tons of other colleges that are doing this. And if you are in a situation like this where you're having trouble, you can reach out to me. I'm sure Amy and Dave feel the same way. Like we're happy to talk to the people at your campus, on a peer-to-peer level and be like, hey, it's so much easier to not do this. Like if they don't want to look at it from a student access lens, well, That's not very nice. But we can also like frame it a different way, speak their language, like whatever. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. As long as we can remove this barrier, however we have to do that, we're here to support you guys too. So that's the biggest thing. And then also like financial aid can be a very, very powerful ally in this. And I do feel like they kind of hold a lot of sway in these conversations. So definitely, like if you're having trouble like getting admissions and records on board, maybe you start with financial aid, and maybe they would have suggestions of, oh, you know what, there's an assistant registrar who I know if I talk to them, I can get them on board. So be creative if you have to, and definitely like lean on us too. Like we are here to support you all in whatever way we can.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So again, just like speaking the language of the stakeholder, I think that you're trying to like, and framing the reasonings in different ways, right? If people are not maybe, if the student centeredness or the values reasoning is not enough, what are the other ways we can frame the benefits for this? And I do always see a very common, like if another college is doing it, if there's an example out there, that is always easier for that certain college to also do it. So thank you for uplifting those. Dave?
You know, it's certainly interesting to think about how institutions evolve their process and whatnot. I remember I reported that this was initially brought up in 2018. In fact, it was like September. I know the legal advisory came out in the summer, but by September 6th or so, our vice president was asking the question of vice presidents. She says, I'm asking that we review our process to determine we are requiring it, why we are requiring additional documentation when self-certification is all that is required. How can we advocate for change that will make our district more welcoming to AB 540 students? And I think what happened as a result, by the 17th of September, registrars had discussed it and come up with some consensus about what we could do. I will say, though, that discussion and reaching consensus there amongst the registrars in the district wasn't easy necessarily because, you know, as supervisors and managers of staff that we have to train on how to process records and, you know, produce compliance in the end, we have, or we had at the time, very clear guidelines on how to read it and what, you know, how to interpret it. And moving away from that is difficult. All right. I'm here to admit it that registrars and admissions and records generally, we're very task oriented and we're trying to deal with a lot of tasks. So as I mentioned, it did come up through our financial aid. So yes, financial aid to our vice president of business services and then out to the whole district. By the time the registrars get to it, our agreement looked somewhat like this, that it's likely that we didn't need to take it to our district's participatory governance structure because we already had come to some quick agreement with the administration and the registrar. So we understood how we could operationalize it. We understood that our policy at the time, the board policy and administrative procedure indicated that the wording was that the district may ask for documentation when a discrepancy exists. So for that reason, we felt like, well, we didn't need to take it to the participatory governance. We didn't need to get something changed in our policy necessarily to comply with this. We should just take the chancellor's office guidance. We did make clear that if inconsistent information is provided on the affidavit, inconsistent with the information delivered by the student under penalty of perjury on their application, that we could require additional documentation to further see about eligibility. And I gotta say, it happens very rarely, and it happens only when there's just really hard discrepancies. I can't even give you a great example right now. So we did say we would continue to verify the CCC apply application information to make sure it's consistent. We also agreed that seniors that are graduating in June can submit their affidavits in advance of graduation. So we're taking it in good faith, right? Which I think was exceeding it. No documentation would be required, including any attendance at adult school. And that was something. So in any case, by the 17th of September of that year, we were in agreement. We were able to move it forward. In terms of announcing it and really being clear on the communications, I think we did a slow rollout. I don't think we were all of one mind. It did take some evolution from individuals, but at least we came, I believe, to the right conclusion.
Hey, yeah, yeah. And I think that's also a really good thing to point out, right? Like, the policy may exist, but how do we make sure that everybody knows about it and is complying with it too? And sometimes that rollout is slow, but the consistency of it too, I think Amy was speaking to that, to make sure that it's always reminded, that it is continually being spoken about, and like that's part of people's trainings, right? When they're doing this work, is like a key step to making sure that it's like successfully implemented too. And I'm also just curious because I think somebody like touched upon this really quick. I have one final question for folks, but this one question too that's coming up right now is, there's always people who are like very against this, right? Or like there's a I think Kyla was mentioning it too. I think you touched upon this already. A lot of the folks here are like Dream Resource Center people and undocumented student support personnel, right? It may be hard to kind of get into those financial aid spaces, those admissions and records spaces, to start those conversations and like kind of win over or show the benefits of this policy. I'm wondering, and like there are some people who are just kind of like against things like this because of the stress of students, different reasons, whatever. I'm wondering if there's specific advice, I think, that you have on kind of how to address like those naysayers, those really like hard to push kind of folks or departments, that you can share with us. And I'll open this up to anybody who wants to go first.
Can I make a more provocative statement? I think
Yeah.
we have in these institutions is it's unfortunate that there's a conflict of interest. And I'm sorry, but people who don't like change and don't want to do work differently or relearn or do more training or all that, it's just hard to fathom. And there is, I believe, a conflict of interest when you ask employees, do you want to retrain? Do you want to learn more? Do you want to do more? So what is needed and what I try to offer, but I also try to solicit from the many levels above me and around me, is that managers know the jobs that their employees are doing in detail, and that they have real strong interaction and request, or I'm sorry, involvement with the work itself, because often we just find that the questions being asked of employees and the conflict of interest around adding more tasks is partially the problem. So when this came to us from vice presidents and when registrars came together on, okay, we're going to change it, we're able to produce a result and a change because we're able to go to our employees with the articulating why we're doing this. If you just go straight to employees and say, hey, I know this is going to be different, it seems to me there's a conflict of interest. And I just think that's something we have to watch out for in these institutions. Thank
you. Thank you. Kyla or Amy, anything you want to add to this specific point?
I don't know if this is the right answer or not, but when I tend to come up against people that are naysayers for whatever reason, I tend to just kind of ask them why. Like, why do you feel this way? Why do you feel that your personal feelings, like, why do you think that you get to impact this decision for students? I kind of just ask why and then pause, and like usually like they're gonna feel shame from that, you know what I mean? Like, and then they're not gonna say like it's because I don't like, they're not gonna say what they really think. And so just by asking why and then pausing, they tend to just kind of like begrudgingly go along with it a little bit. I don't know if that's the right technique or not, but it has been effective for trying to change things around here anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Amy, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I've kind of been talking about this, but in addition to what I've already shared, I guess when asking folks who aren't on board why they're not on board, gently, without making them feel defensive, hopefully, it's just listening. And you may not, for me, there's just like a certain amount of energy I'm going to spend with people, right? So if we know who those people are. Like the people who really are suspicious about students and, think that it's their like life's work to make sure that there's like a 0% fraud. Like, let's just be real. That's what people are scared of. It's like
Yeah.
fraud and, and believing that certain types of groups of students or people are like more susceptible, to fraud. And so those are the folks where I'm not going to spend a lot of time with them in terms of speaking to the heart, right? I am going to talk about if they are someone in A&R who's directly impacted by this work, it's actually less work for you. Right. But if you're trying to move this along, think about who are the decision makers, but then also who are the people on your campus who have soft power. I think like soft power is a really important part of change, because the decision makers often are like bombarded by so many things that it's the folks who have the soft power who kind of help bring it along, speak, kind of be like little bird, the little bee, I don't know what it is. To kind of help move things along. And again, I just like really want to emphasize, think about how does this benefit different people? So of course, everyone wants to say like, yeah, if it's in the benefit of students, but how do you create an urgency around it? It's by speaking to like how it impacts their work, right? How it makes their job easier. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. And I'm just gonna actually have this final question for everybody. We do have a lot of college, like mostly community colleges, right? You all heard in the introductions in the space. I think many of them do not quite have self-certification implemented at their campuses. Maybe the first time that folks are hearing about it today. And so I'm wondering what's kind of like the advice for like the first step. Somebody's going to leave this meeting like this is something that's really going to benefit us, our students, our campus in general. What advice do you have for them for like the first step they can take in like moving this policy along in their campus? And so I'll go with Dave, Amy, and then Kyla.
Step or moving the policy along. So I think not spending a lot of time speaking to the heart of people that you feel are not already allied and on board. That was a very interesting statement Amy made. So trying to identify the people that are amenable. I think the participatory governance is a good place to discuss it and deal with it. I think the administration, again, I've relied heavily on them to say, it was because we had a sort of enlightened vice president that was interested to bring it to other vice presidents that really brought it to our attention, because for us, we had been doing it that way and we thought, oh, this is, very regular. So I think writing up language that would go in front of students that would give them, the process so that the stakeholders can see the streamlined process for students. That to me is the most salient thing you can offer. One way we do it, and one thing I want to suggest is in CCC Apply, you have messages and rules based on the information that the person gives you. So the algorithm that determines they are, potentially eligible for AB 540, that can trigger a separate message. And we do that here where we're trying to give detail to students on what is required or what it is, because that confusion part is so deep. And so even before they get an acceptance email that might indicate a non-resident status and what to do about it, with links to the AB 540 and the non-resident reclassification, and more detail on California residency generally. Even before they receive that, they're likely to get a CCC Apply generated message from us just based on what they answered in their thing. So in crafting that message to students, you're essentially letting them know how streamlined the process can be. So I would suggest sharing that with stakeholders around your college or district to get it started. It's also true, we've been told not to change the form because it's agreed between the CSU and the CCC. And I'll admit, we made it online during COVID, and we even added some better branding to the top of it because it looks so terrible. I wish they would make the form look better just to make it more exciting. But anyway, the idea being that I would bring a revised form, an online form, and I would bring the streamlined process for students to any stakeholders that want to hear about it, and just suggest there's 40-something colleges doing it in the state, and we really got to move to this because there are huge benefits to staff and to students and to equity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that CCC Apply messaging is a really great point. So I'll go with Amy next.
I would say first try and think about who are like the first level decision makers and what's your proximity to them, or who is in proximity to them that can kind of help you get some messaging. Right now, I think it's like in everyone's benefit to frame this in terms of enrollment and SCIF, right? Like we're removing barriers for students, we're helping with enrollment. AB 540 is a SCIF metric, right? We need to get our AB 540 numbers up for funding. So I think that's kind of the place that I would encourage folks to start, and then also make sure you have like the legal advisory, right? And say like, this is a trend, this is what's happening, we need to get on board. So that's where I would start.
Thank you. Kyla?
In addition to what Amy and Dave said, I would say, especially like if you're in a dream center, to find your allies before you that's your first step, just for like emotional support too, so you don't feel like you're going at this alone, is to find somebody in admissions, find somebody in financial aid, and then you've got your little core group, and then you guys can either grow bigger if you need to have that larger presence to like put more pressure, or you've got people to talk to about it at least, and then also a college that's maybe nearby you or that's considered a competitor that does the self-certification, to connect with them as well, so that you have like, oh hey, like for us it's always like everybody's always talking about Chafee, so if I was to go and say, Chafee's doing this, why aren't we doing this? Then, people are going to be like, ooh, maybe we should. So that's my other piece of advice.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for uplifting all of those things, right? I think this was I learned a lot in this conversation too. I was really excited to like uplift self-certification in general when I first heard about it, because I was an AB 540 student and I know it was really hard to I recently applied to a community college and I had to prove my AB 540 status to take one class, and I've been out of high school for 10 years. And so I'm like, even imagine, I think for like different folks with different educational status, like AB 540 opens up so many doors for us, to not have that and to like put additional burden is really terrible. And so I was really excited to uplift this for everybody and to kind of get more information on how this gets implemented for people, for people's campuses. And so really appreciate all that you shared today. This information is recorded, so I know I'll be kind of going back to like pinpoint the different strategies that folks said. And I also want to call on our audience to just give appreciations, comments, anything in general for our panelists. But thank you all for the amazing work that you're doing on your campuses already, and also for sharing sharing it with us in this space today. And so I'll transition us to see if there's any, I think I have time for like one question or so, if somebody wants to unmute or put it in the chat. And again, yeah, if there's any like comments that people also want to make, feel free to do that as well. So I'll take a pause to see if anybody wants to do that. I don't see anything in the chat, but if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. This is Victoria with CSAC. So I'm just very curious with AB 1540 going into effect this year. So that's where the affidavit is now part of the DREAM Act application. Have you already been implementing changes for that, or how's that going to be going forward?
No implementation here, and I'm a little jealous that we can't be the solver of the problem, because they'll be filling it out elsewhere, and then we're not clear how we'll be accessing it yet. So I'm really interested in implementation, but haven't crossed that barrier yet.
Yeah, anybody wanna?
We're in the same boat.
It might be a early question to ask Victoria, because I know we're curious about this too and do really want to host another session with this. Kyla, is there anything you want to add for this?
We already have ours all planned out. We've talked to financial aid, admissions, so we're going to have a shared spreadsheet where financial aid just puts it there. We kind of talked back and forth, like, do we need to have admissions staff have access to, but I didn't like that idea. That made me really nervous. Separation of church and state. So they're just going to give us the list, because again, why would financial aid lie about it? Financial aid never lies. Okay. So they're going to give us the list. we're gonna flag them as AB 540, and then that's it. And then they will upload it into OnBase financial aid bill. So that's how we're doing it.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I know that's still kind of pending and we will probably address 1540 at a different space, but thank you, Victoria, for that question. I actually see another question in the chat. I'll just take that one. Daniela, I see your hand up, so I'm going to ask you to hold your question just because I want us to have some time to do quick breakout groups, but just for one person here in the panel, maybe to clarify, how can a student fill out the affidavit with their credits and hours information if they don't have a transcript? I don't know if anybody wants to take that.
I mean, I think Nancy answered it. And then also if they know, like if they graduated high school, then that's easy peasy.
Right.
But also like we'll help them too. We'll be like, how many years, how many classes? And a lot of times students will have some of their transcripts. Sometimes they do need help like doing the calculations. And so we're like, you know, if you want to bring them in, we can like sit down with you and help you figure it out. But then we just don't take them from the student. But most students have something, like they'll have like schedule printouts or something. So it's very rare that a student doesn't have anything.
Right. Yeah. So I think just to clarify too, right, like the transcripts can still be helpful in filling that information out. And as folks mentioned, as Kyla is mentioning here, like that could be useful in helping like discern what information to put in the AB 540 form. But the difference is the admissions and records registrar is not asking for that information. So not an additional like documentation that people have to turn in. So thank you for clarifying that too. Okay, so I think we have time for a quick breakout group. We encourage our panelists to kind of stay around to participate in those if possible. But I'm gonna actually put up my screen really quickly. And this is just for folks to kind of reflect on what was said. Lots of great information shared, lots of new information shared. And so we're going to put folks in breakout groups. I think we'll probably just have about 6 minutes for it to kind of share any of these 3 questions or talk about any of these 2 questions about what's something new you learned here today. What can you take back to your campus or organization? And what would you like to explore more beyond this meeting? And I think Nancy will put those questions in the chat if she has not already. We'll go ahead and open those breakout groups and have folks interact in those for about 6 minutes.